welcome everyone to Friday, October 28th Simio Solutions Series. Today's session is going to be on dashboarding. My name is Dan Vasileni. I'm the VP of Global Sales here at Simio, and doing most of the talking today and presenting is going to be Jason Sarasoli. There is both of our email addresses in case you need to get a hold of one of us either during this session or after this session. I'll probably bring this back up at the end just in case anyone does need to contact us. Couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Please be aware that we are recording today's session for replay purposes. If you would like to go back and watch this session again or refer it on to a colleague or a friend, please visit Simio's website, simio.com. Usually we have the session recorded and up on our website about a couple hours after the session is over. It all depends on how long the recording takes to download and get uploaded, but regardless, it should be up probably by the end of the weekend. Also be aware, all participants, when you enter today, you will be on mute. So if you try to ask a question, we will not be able to hear you. The best way to get a question across during today's session is there should be a GoToWebinar dashboard somewhere on your screen. On my screen, it's on the right side. You may have moved it. It might not be on your right, but it should be there somewhere. There is a question or a chat box. I would recommend using the question box. Type any question in there. And what we will do is towards the end of the session, Jason will leave a little bit of time that we will try to get some questions answered. If there is a question that's very relevant to something that Jason is talking about, I will try to interrupt him and bring the question up at that point in time. But regardless, we will try to get to all questions. Today's session is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. Jason has about 40 to 45 minutes of presentation to go through. So we will definitely leave some time at the end for questions. Next, we have one more solution series scheduled for the remainder of this year on Friday, November 18th. It's called Auto Placement and Creation of Objects for Rapid Data-Driven Modeling, and we are doing what we're terming our Simio Partner Spotlight. So we are going to be featuring Simulation Engineering Technologies. One of our partners from around the globe will be doing this presentation. So we look forward to everyone joining that time. Next, just so everyone is aware, we are extending the solution series into 2023. We are audio is lost. Can everyone hear me? Just give me a quick sound check, Jason.
Yes, I can.
All right, thank you. So we are going to have a full calendar scheduled for 2023. Our plans for 2023 is to have one solution series a month, and it'll be on a specific date or a specific Friday every month. So it's either the second or third Friday we're planning. So you can set your schedules accordingly and know that it'll always be on the same day of the month or at the same time. So just be on the lookout for that. We hope to have our calendar published sometime towards the end of this year, maybe in the next few weeks. If not by the end of December, we will definitely have the entire calendar for 2023 published. So we do thank everyone for their attendance in 2022 here. It seems like the solution series definitely picked up some steam, and we had a lot of positive feedback about it. So we get that positive feedback, and we are more than willing to continue holding these things as it is valuable to you guys. Next, if you are watching this session on recording, or if you had watched one of our prior sessions, so we had planned a Simio Sync for October, around this time frame actually. What we decided to do, we had a tremendous amount of interest and content for the session. So instead of kind of jamming things into a one-day session in October, we have decided to go back to pre-pandemic time, where we're going to do one Simio Sync per year. That Simio Sync will be next year, and we plan on doing this particular session still virtual. We are not going to go in person hopefully in the following year. But next year, March 1st and 2nd, 2023, we will be doing Simio Sync. It'll be 2 days. And like I said, we did have a ton of content that was being offered up for the October session we were planning, and we actually had too much stuff to put into one session, so we decided to kind of hold off and wait to do one big session next year. All right, that's it for me. Jason, I will turn things over to you. I keep getting that I have an issue with my audio, so I hope that got through. Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you, yes, and you are ready to roll.
Okay, great. Start sharing my screen.
I'll tell you when I can see it. There you go. You're good to go.
Okay, great. Hello everyone, thanks for joining this session. Today's session is going to be on dashboarding inside of Simio. Back when these solution series started back in May, my colleague Adam presented a similar dashboarding, but more basic in terms of the capabilities of dashboarding. And I just want to touch upon that. So if anybody did attend that session, this will be building upon that, but as well as this will cover the basics too. So if you have no dashboarding experience, you will also get some information about this. Hopefully it'll be valuable to you. As Dan said, my name is Jason Sarasoli, and I'm a project engineer here at Simio. I've been working with the company for about 3 years. Primarily being a project engineer, I work on the consulting side, but I am involved in some of the hypercare accounts as well. For today, the first thing we're going to start off with is talking about some of the basics of dashboarding. And I think it's always important to start with the very, very basics in terms of defining the purpose of dashboards and some of the questions you should be asking yourself before you even start clicking around in the software. This was touched upon a little bit, so this will be a little recap. Adam did do a good job of this back in May, but I think it's still important to reiterate. Once we have that defined and talked about, I'm going to then transfer over to talking about actually creating the dashboards. And most of this presentation will be in the software itself. And I do think that's probably the best way for all of you guys to see clicking around and whatnot. That demo, there's be about 2 demos building 2 separate dashboards. And those will highlight different types of dashboards and the capabilities inside of Simio, as well as some of the different data sources. Throughout those demos, I'll be highlighting some of the filtering techniques, as well as the enhancements and tips. And then I'll be coming back to the slides to finish the presentation. As Dan mentioned, please feel free to chat your questions throughout the presentation. There'll be a few natural pauses, but I also am not afraid to be interrupted. So Dan and Adam, whoever else is managing questions, feel free to jump in if the question is relevant. Okay, first thing to talk about is defining the purpose. So when you build dashboards, I would argue that the most important part is to answer the question, why are you dashboarding? There's many different use cases to a dashboard. It could be to talk about metrics, to show metrics. It could be to understand a system. It could be to just debug the model. But I think it's very important to define that before you even start clicking around in the software. The software itself, it's quite easy to build dashboards, excuse me, and they are kind of intuitive and you can make them quite fast. But because of that, there is kind of this idea or this caution that you can kind of lose track of why you're dashboarding. So I always tell people when I'm asked to give dashboarding advice is the first thing you should do is really ideally sketch it up in your head or on a piece of paper for what you're trying to convey. And that kind of segues into the second point here, which is dashboards, they convey a message and they tell a story. And there really is, what message and story are you trying to tell? And that's something that I think it's sometimes lost on beginning dashboarders or when they're building models. It's always trying to remember what is the message you're trying to tell when you're building that dashboard. Next is this idea of making sure your message or story is intuitive. I think, as you'll see in a second, building dashboards is quite fast in Simio, but to make a really good dashboard, it's a little bit more challenging to have the story be intuitive. And I think that's something that you should always try to convey and try to strive for, which is making your dashboards be intuitive. And in a sense, the gut reaction or someone's first conclusion is what you actually want them to go to. I'm going to touch upon that point in a little bit more. The next slide. And then last is understanding who is going to be consuming your dashboard. Who's the audience? Is it senior level management, or is it maybe shop foreman or floor workers? So depending on how you answer that question is really going to depend on the level of detail of your dashboard. So I always tell people to make sure that you define these characteristics or these things before you start clicking around in the software. So as I mentioned once, I'm going to reiterate it once more. My philosophy, and I think many people at Simio would say, that the ultimate goal is to strive for dashboards that are intuitive and lead the user to the correct conclusion. Back in May, Adam had quite a few nice graphics on this, but it's very easy to make a dashboard with different colors and charts that can draw the user to make an incorrect conclusion. So I think it's kind of a responsibility of the modeler and the person building the dashboard to really think about this and to make sure that the conclusion that is intuitive is what you're striving for. There's a few simple ways to do this. For me, my personal best practice is to build a dashboard and then share it with people, share it with my coworkers, my colleagues, because I think sometimes when you're working in these environments where it's only you can just believe that your models or your dashboard's intuitive and you understand it, but it's easy for it to be lost in that. So again, I'm just going to say this once more because I do think it's quite imperative, is that make sure your dashboards are intuitive and then lead the user to the correct conclusion. Ideally, and like the best case would be with minimum explanation, but sometimes that's not really possible. Sometimes the dashboards or the systems you're trying to show are kind of complex, so an explanation is provided. But if you didn't need to give an explanation, that would be a great dashboard. Okay, so now before we jump into the software itself, just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about or what I'm going to show. I'm going to create two dashboards for you live using an example model. These examples or the demos that I'm going to provide will be highlighting the dashboard editor and kind of the lay of the land of the dashboard interface in Simio. I'm going to show different types of dashboards, how to create them, how to use the different types of data sources, as well as how to make new data sources, being a federated source and a calculated field. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to the software. So you should be seeing Simio right now. So for this demo, I'm actually going to use one of the example models that is downloaded with the software once you install it, and that is the scheduling bicycle assembly. This is one of our larger models that comes with the software, and it really highlights our data-driven and data-generated approach to building models. So this model is generated using our data schema, which is the ISA 95 schema, which is pretty much a standard schema of manufacturing data being, and I'll show you right now. So it has a bunch of structure of tables. So we have this whole table structure that is pretty much just a template. And for this example model, all this data was already populated. So if you were following along live right now, you could actually open this model in the support tab, go to the examples and open this model and you would see the same thing. And actually, besides for doing dashboards, I'm not actually touching any of the model logic in this model. So you could follow along if you wanted to. So just a quick overview for people who are not familiar with this model. So this is a representing a bicycle assembly facility. So we have a component manufacturing area where we're actually taking in raw goods and producing the parts or the components of the bicycle. And then we have an assembly line where we're more or less putting everything together and making bikes. This model has quite a bit of complex logic to more or less represent this data-driven approach. And I would recommend anybody who has lots of questions on this or who's not familiar to see the attached PDF. When you open this model, you would see a PDF. And again, this is just a good plug for these example models. They are quite detailed, and I think they provide a lot of good content if you're stuck on something. Okay, so for this model, I'm just gonna review some of the high-level data because when we dashboard it, so you can see what we're dashboarding. So this model is pretty much comprised of a bunch of different data tables, as I just showed. The first one that we're gonna talk about here is this manufacturing orders table. And this is simply going to be the demand table. So we have orders, we have customers, maybe the type of material, and you can see we have different finished goods, be it bikes, and also component parts, and also some other subassemblies. We have due dates, release dates, quantities, and priorities, and whatnot. We also have the resources table. This is how everything's being created as well. So you can see in this model, we do have quite a few resource objects, be it the assembly line machines, and those would be power, final, and test, or the component manufacturing facilities. As well as we do have workers in here, and we will be dashboarding on these workers. So you can see these are actual worker objects, and we're gonna be looking at some of their usage. Okay, so now to actually go into the dashboards. So by default, let me back up. To view the dashboards, you go into the results tab, and there is a dashboard button on the left. This example comes with 3 dashboards already installed or already developed for you. We have an order detail one, we have a material dashboard, and we have a dispatch list. So if you did want to see some dashboards, you could look at them and see how they're built. But for this example model, this webinar, I'm actually going to create some on the fly for you. So the first thing to create a dashboard is you need to click this plus arrow, and a window is going to pop up that shows you have to name it. So this dashboard I'm going to talk about, and before I even start clicking, I should follow my rule, which is the dashboard I'm going to show you now, which is I'm going to define the purpose, is going to be on utilization. So we're going to look into how all the resources in the model are being used throughout the model run. So we're looking at the resources, the vehicles, the operators, and how they're being used throughout the system. Were they busy? How much were they busy? And kind of look at how to visualize those metrics. So I'm going to create a new dashboard. And by default, this window, which opened in a second monitor, will pop up. And this is the dashboard editor window. So the lay of the land of this editor window, as you can see, so by default, and this is just a quick aside here, when this window is open, you're not able to click on the other Simio version. I think that's pretty intuitive. Most people will probably already understand this, but sometimes this window, if you have multiple screens, can open up on a separate screen, and maybe you don't know you have it open, and you'll be clicking on Simio and it's not responding. Simio is not frozen, it's just telling you that there is another window open and you need to more or less close this window before you get into the other Simio window. Okay, so lay of the land on the dashboard editor. So on the top, we have the same ribboned approach. So for the home tab, we have the save button, and we have all of these options for the different types of dashboards that you can enter into your dashboard, be it grids, pivots, charts, and we're going to show these throughout this demo. And then we have some options for how to actually go about changing those dashboards. On the left side, we have all of the data sources that we can use and we can dashboard on or across. By default, Simio is going to give you access to all of the log data sources, as well as all of the tables. And that is also output tables, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. But you can also use a created table via an output table and dashboard on that, which is something that is quite often done. So to people who aren't familiar with Simio or are not familiar with the log structure, typically when we talk about utilization dashboards, we're usually going to be using the resource usage log or the resource state log, because that's really where Simio by default or automatically captures all that data. And this example, there's going to be no exception. We're going to use the resource state log because it really is telling us all that we would need to know for utilization. So once we click on that data source, it shows all of the columns that are available to dashboard on. So to start, I'm going to simply create a pie chart for utilization. So we clicked on pie and you can see now we have these options to drag and drop into those fields. So to create a dashboarding or to create a utilization, we throw the duration as the values and you can see it's automatically updating on the right. We're going to throw in the resource itself as the argument, or as a series, excuse me, then the auto state as the argument. So pretty fast, by simply doing 3 clicks, we created these pretty detailed pie charts for all the utilization in the model. And you can see that was pretty fast. However, while this is really great, it is kind of a lot and it's kind of hard to see. And typically when we're doing utilization, maybe we want to do aggregates or maybe we want to focus in on a certain type of worker. So those types of things are also supported inside of the dashboards themselves. So my first enhancement to this would be maybe we're interested in looking at the aggregate over the type of resource. So if you scan here, you see we have assemblers, we have some operations or workstations, then we have some operators, and then we have some vehicles. So in Simio, a nice and an easy way in the dashboards is we can now create our custom columns to more or less group things for aggregate purposes. And the way we would do that is by creating a calculated field in the dashboard editor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this calculated field, and it's going to allow me to create a new data item that lives inside this resource usage log, but it's only being visible in the dashboard editor itself. And this is a kind of a fast and really kind of an easy way to more or less synthesize and add data for dashboarding purposes without having to go in and create the column in the log, which sometimes can be kind of cumbersome. So I'd use these feature quite a lot, and I'd always recommend people that if you can't exactly get your data to work in the way you want, calculated fields are a great tool to have in your toolbox. So as soon as you open this up, you get this dashboard expression editor at your disposal, and you can kind of more or less create code in, but it does help you what you'd want this expression or this new column just to do. So for this, since we're doing an aggregate, I'm just going to do an if statement that's going to be looking at the names of each one of these resources and specifying it as a category. So if it's like starts with assembler, it's going to be an assembly. If it starts with operator, it's going to be an operator. If it starts with a vehicle, it's going to be a vehicle, and so on and so forth. And the reason why we have to do that is because then we can look at all of the assemblers as one group. So to do that, we're going to click on the logical section, and we're going to look at the if. So we're just going to do an if statement. I seem to be I'm a big fan of this window here because one, it provides you syntax errors in real time, and two, it tells you how to actually make this expression. So you can actually see the syntax right here, and this doesn't go away while you're building the dashboard. So to do this, we're going to do starts with. So we're going to say starts with, and it pops down for you. We're going to say starts with the resource name, starts with, let's say, assembler, assemble. And we're going to call those assemblers. And I'm just going to do a few of these if statements, and then I'm going to just copy and paste the rest for the sake of time. Resource, let's say it starts with op, and that is going to be an operator. And so on and so forth. One of the handy things about this window that I'm showing you now is it allows you to copy and paste the expressions. So since I built this and I've kind of rehearsed this ahead of time, I'm actually just going to copy and paste this expression in for the sake of time. So you can see it's just a simple if statement that's looking at the beginning of this resource name and specifying it more or less a category or a resource type. Once we click OK, we'll see we have this new calculated field option available on the bottom. I always tell people to rename these because calculated field 1 is not very useful in terms of what that is. So we're going to call this resource type. And now if we pull off the resource and we drag on the resource type, you'd see now we have aggregated utilization for each one of these different types of resources. We can also further enhance this, and this is where I think the dashboards get really interesting and quite powerful with interactivity. So what we're able to do now is, let's say in the same view, I want to be able to click on the assemblers category and look at all of the assemblers inside of that. That is quite easily supported inside of the dashboards. So we would click on here, and this is a good time to talk about this, these tabs on the top. So depending on which dashboard you actually have selected, the tabs on the top will change. And this is similar to how Simio itself works on in terms of where you are in the model. But this really is an important thing. We're going to be clicking on these tabs quite a lot throughout the model. So we're going to make these a series, and we're going to say drill down. And now we're going to drag on the resource. And you can see now we have this blue shaded. And what it allows us to do is click on this, and now we can go and then look into all of the assemblers in that model. And of course, to go back up, there's a little arrow here. And we can go at other ones as well. And you can see it makes the dashboards quite interactive, which is pretty neat. Okay, so now that we've done kind of this basic utilization dashboards, I kind of wanted to then pivot a little bit, no pun intended actually, and then to now talk about a grid, other types of grids. So I'm going to simply remove this, go back to the data source, and we're going to add a new dashboard. And I'm going to remove this filter for the time being, just because we don't need it. We're going to pull this off. And maybe just for clarity, we will throw this on back to square one. A few handy tips when you're making dashboards. One, there is this button duplicate. It's probably my best friend when it comes to dashboards. I tend to duplicate a lot more. And then the reason being, because there's another option called convert. So we can simply make this into a different type of data dashboard, which is very handy. So you can see I very quickly, and it usually changes the data in the way you want. Quickly did that without having to create a new one and drag all them on. So you can see within a matter of seconds, I made a graphical and a tabular format of the same data. And this is really handy if you'd want to export this out to some sort of data source, or maybe even create a report on this. Having that in a tabular format could be much better. And of course, we can add more details. Let's say, for example, we cared about when they actually started, when they actually ended, maybe the actual duration itself. It's already on there actually. By default, it's going to be a year. That's not really helpful. So we're going to change that to be date, hour, minute, and date, hour, minute. So you can see very quickly, we made this 2 different dashboards just by simply duplicating and then copying and converting to. Okay, so now we have pretty much the same data, just shown in a visual and a tabular format. Now let's say, for example, we want to know what assembler first shift or number 1 was actually doing. Like, we know they're off shift, we know they're busy, we know they're starved, but what were they actually doing when they were busy? What were they working on and for how long? To do that, we're going to pull in another data source and look at that. So the data that I just mentioned, that's all stored in the resource usage log, which again, a different type of data source. I think there is a misconception that inside of a single dashboard with multiple elements, you need to have the same data source. That's not true. This one is, these two, the pie one and the grid one, are both using the state log, but to create a new graph, you can simply have it to be any resource, data source that you'd want. So I'm going to create this new grid, and you can see we're going to put it down here. It's a little bit, you'll learn how to navigate these with experience. But so now we have this new grid, and we're going to specify that this grid 2 is going to use the resource usage log. And now let's create, we'll just throw in some information here. So we'll put the customer, we'll put the location, put the material, we'll put the owner, and then we'll put the start and end time as well, and the duration. And then we'll also put on the resource just so we can have something that ties them all together. And again, we'll change this to be not year, but something more meaningful or more detailed. Okay, great. So now we have 3 different dashboards. And let's say we put this back so that we can then filter down on this. So before we have this as a filter, so a single filter. And now you can see that when we click on this, it filters. However, you may have noticed only these 2 are filtering. The bottom is not filtering. The main reason for that is because right now, the filters, there's a setting called cross data source filtering. And I think this is a really powerful feature, but pretty much what it allows you to do is say, this is a filter, but these are different data sources. So these are on the same one, and these 2 are different from this one. These are the usage, the state log, this is the usage. So if you enable this button, now you can see we're actually filtering this and this simultaneously, which is pretty interesting to think about it. So now we can say, for example, this assembler 2, he was busy for 20% of the time, and here's what he was actually working on for the entire model. He's working on these orders and these times and these durations. So you can then really really drill down to see what that operator was using. So you can see that these filters and everything like that, they really allow you to enhance your dashboards and make them more interactive and not so static, which I think is really a powerful feature of our dashboards as well. You can also add other types of filters as well. So currently I'm just showing this as a filter, but we could also add in a specific filter element, which is quite a few of them. So I'm a fan of the tree filters, and specify that as well. Whoops. And maybe we want to filter on that calculated column, which then I'll show you right now. So say we have this calculated column. By default, maybe you'll expect or see or know what's going to happen. When I click on this to start, this does not convert down here, or this does not filter, and that is because this resource type is not defined inside of the state log or inside the resource usage log. So luckily, as I showed you before, we can just copy and paste that. So we're going to edit this expression and copy this whole thing and add it to this log as well. Create a field. Okay, and then rename this. And drag it on. And now you can see everything updates in series. Oops, I apologize, we need to have this cross data filtering. And now you can see everything that's being updated all together. So you can see this is about 7 or 8 minutes. I'm going to create a pretty fast and quite detailed utilization dashboard with some interesting filters and some interactivity. I'm going to pause for a second, ask for questions before I go to the next dashboarding example to see if there's any questions from the room.
Perfect. So at this point in time, Jason, there are no questions in the chat. Just a reminder for anyone that is attending, please feel free to type your questions in the question box as we go along, and we'll get them answered. So go ahead, Jason.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, one other thing to note, well, this is a good segue. You do have to save the dashboards, so you can save them, and then once you close out here, then they'll actually be saved into your model. A little bit of another thing before we go into the next dashboard is the actual dashboard tab itself. You can rearrange them as well, so you can sort them around however way you'd want, which is kind of a nice thing. Here's how you actually edit the dashboard, rename it, and kind of pretty simple things. But what I wanted to highlight are these two buttons here. Dashboards themselves, they're an XML file, more or less. And in Simio, we allow you to export and import dashboards from one model to another. And I think this is a really, really great feature, especially if you're working with another modeler. So for example, when I've worked on projects in the past, we would have my colleague be working on the model logic or doing some things in the facility window, for example, and I'd be doing dashboarding. And we could kind of be in two separate models at the same time. And as long as my data sources that I was using were not being changed in the model, I could simply copy and paste my dashboards from one model to the other. And I think this is something that I hope everyone's aware of, but I just wanted to bring attention to it because if you are, or you say you're making a lot of templatized models, you could have some standard dashboards that you could just simply copy and paste from one model to another. And they will, as long as the column names exist, they'll all update automatically, which is, I think, is a pretty powerful feature. Okay, so now let's kind of shift gears and let's talk about another dashboard about the orders themselves. So in this example that I just showed you, I really was about utilization and the resources, and I wanted to highlight some of the basic filterings. In this next example that I'm going to show, I'm going to highlight some more of the advanced filtering techniques by using an order level approach, or instead of looking at resources, we're going to look at the orders themselves. So to do that, I'm going to create a new dashboard, and we're just going to call it orders for this. Again, it's going to open another window that we've seen before. And now, so my vision for this dashboard is going to be then to look at order level details. So let's see how each order did, maybe even look at customers and see which customers have the most demand for the system, which customers required the most processing time, maybe which orders took the longest to get through our system in terms of processing time, and all those questions. So again, just a different perspective to look at the model. Before it was by a resource perspective. Now we're going to look at it by order perspective. So my intention with this model is additionally is I'm going to try to pull on some more information than is typically available on the resource usage log. So as we showed, I briefly showed a second ago, the resource usage log is where most of the information that you'd see, like for example, in the Gantt chart in Simio, is being stored, but not everything is being there. And typically as you build models, especially with these data generated approaches, you might have data being stored in different tables, and sometimes you want to more or less synthesize them and dashboard on that single source. And while it's not impossible, and sometimes it's easier to just create columns or unique columns on your resource usage log and pull on the information to the log, the other option that we allow you to do is to actually federate and create new data sources that more or less join tables together. So the way that you do that, and by default, you're not going to see that here, but when you click on the data source tab, you would see there's this option to create a new data source. So that is what we're going to do. You can see there's a bunch of options here. For this demonstration, we're going to do a data federation. And if any of you in the audience have experience with databases, this is going to look very familiar because this is pretty much what it is. And now we can more or less create a join of two tables and pull on and create a new federated data source to dashboard upon. So for this one, we're going to do the usage log, and it's going to pop up this window here on the left. And it's going to then, we're also then going to join that with the manufacturing orders. As soon as I clicked on the manufacturing orders, it popped up with this window and says, how do you want to join the two? So we're going to use an inner join. And for the purpose of this discussion, we're just going to stick with the inner join. This could be a whole separate webinar in terms of how to join stuff, but that's kind of not really Simio specific. That's just database and relational tables. But to join these two, we're simply going to do the manufacturing orders, the order ID, that's just the order name of the order, and the usage log dot owner. You're probably wondering how I know that. Besides the fact that I looked at it ahead of time, when you build your data structure, you would know, and you need to know this before you get in there, because it's important to note that in the window that you're seeing, it doesn't allow you, Simio doesn't allow you to go back and look. So just make sure you know how you're going to match these up. However, you can change this after the fact, so it's not like you need to, if you messed up, you could always change this. Everything's editable. So I'm going to simply drag this one over here, make this one a little bit bigger so you can see all the columns, and the same with this one. So now we're just going to simply figure out which, or select which columns we want for our new data source. So for this one, I want all the usage log, and you can see it pops up here at the bottom. And I want the order status. This is going to tell us if it's a new or WIP order. Let's see, I want the priority as well. And you could add whatever you wanted to, honestly, to this federated data source. But in terms of simplicity, I'm just going to add those 2 points and click OK. Now you'll see we have this new interface that popped up, and it's going to show you what's the data source and what's the query. So it is possible to have multiple queries, but again, for the purpose of this webinar, we're not going to go into that. But the federated possibilities and the federated capabilities are pretty complex in Simio, and I think that's something that if you do have many data sources, you can do multiple joins on them and create a simple or a single source inside the dashboard, which is conducive because it might be faster to do that here than as opposed to having to build a whole separate table in your model just for a dashboarding purpose. Okay, so then now that we have this new data source, let's actually use it for a dashboard. So we're going to create a new grid, which is just an Excel file more or less. Let's throw on the location. We'll do the owner. We'll do the material name, the customer, start and end time so we know what was happening, the duration, and the order status. And like I always do, we'll change these year to be more, or the date to be more specific or more detailed. So quickly, before we kind of go into anything further, you can see what we've done with a federated source is now we've more or less created a source that's combining the usage log and pulling on the corresponding order status for this order. I'm just gonna say that once more because I think maybe it might be missed. This is the usage log, but this column does not exist in the usage log. We federated it and pulled it onto this data source. So again, if you need to pull in data, this is another option to use. You could, as I mentioned at the beginning, add a new column and create a new column in the log if you wanted to, but sometimes working with the logs can be a little tricky, and this might be easier. But again, just another capability that we have inside of our dashboard expressions editors. So from this, now we have a very simple grid, which kind of shows a bunch of information in terms of what each order was doing at each location, and maybe even want a resource on here as well. So we could say, who is it actually working on it? So you can see all the types of workers were working on it, where they were working, as well as what is that part, or what is that type, and what and what not. You can see the durations. Now let's say, for example, let's say we want to now have a visual representation of this. So we'll make this into a grid, or a chart, excuse me. By default, it's kind of messy, so we're going to pull off some of this information. And we're just going to pull all these off. And maybe we're just going to do it by order. And there should be another dashboard. Oh, it must have been deleted on accident. So we're going to click back. So we're going to make that quickly. Apologize for that. I must have dragged it on the wrong side. But there's a back button, which is always a godsend. And now we're going to duplicate this. See, I did it messed up here. Duplicate this, and now we're going to convert this to a chart. So you can see, even when I made a mistake, it's pretty fast. Dashboard editors are pretty quick. So you can quickly drag and drop all this off what you need. And maybe we'll put the resource as the location as the series. And then we'll stack this. There's different types of charts, as you can see. So this is just right now it's plotting all the lines on the same axis, but maybe we want to stack them, which is a little bit more meaningful. And you can see now pretty quickly, we made a new dashboard now that has the stacking of all the operations, and we can kind of see that which orders were taking the most time to process and which ones weren't, and where they were actually processing. We can also use the zoomable features, which I think is a nice feature here. So if we were to click on the format, the axis here, yeah. So we can also do zooming as well, but it's kind of just an enhancement thing. It's not super important for the time being. And now maybe we want to add a filter to this. Maybe we want to look at certain orders. So maybe we'll add a filter. And we want to dig down on a certain type of order. So if we add an owner here, this now allows us to then drill down onto a certain order. And you can see now we can look at that order in terms of what it was actually doing, all the start times for that order as well, and the resources, and then a tabular format of that, which is all pretty simple. It's pretty similar to what we just showed, but just again, from an order perspective, not a resource perspective. Now I want to pivot gears and talk a little bit about, or change gears, excuse me, about groups. So everything I've been showing you has kind of been at the same level. We've had filters, and filters apply to certain types of dashboard elements. But there's this other item up here on the top of in the dashboard editor called a group. And what a group allows you to do is control which filters apply to which, and to more or less have independent filters. So when you create a group, it creates an empty box, and you have to drag in all of the corresponding dashboard editors or create them into that group. By default, inside of the group is exactly like we just saw. It affects everything's filtered the exact same way. But what groups allow you to do now, and especially when you have multiple of them, is you can then have the filters behave independently from group to group. So what do I mean by that? If we add a new group for this example, let me make my window a little bit larger. So this, as I showed you before, is about ordered level details. Let's say, for example, that we now wanted to look at customer level details. So let's look at this data, but spliced in a different way. So let's create a new group, and we're going to create a new chart. By default, it's going to appear outside of both groups. So we have to drag it into the group. And we're going to add duration. Oops, didn't grab it. Duration, the resource, the argument, and the customer as the series. And again, we're going to stack this as well, just so it's a little bit easier to see. So you can see we have two graphs going on right now. On the left, all the order stuff, and on the right is now going to show you the processing duration for each customer, which is interesting, and maybe this is of use case. But what's really interesting is how we can now filter these independently. So now if we add a new editor and drag this inside of group 2, and let's say we want to filter on the customer itself. What you'll see now is when I click on Costco, for example, it only edited or it only filtered this group and did not affect this at all. So you can more or less do simultaneous grouping at the same time, which I think is quite interesting, especially if the message you're trying to convey is a comparison of multiple data sources. So again, this is a great tip to do that. However, where it gets even more interesting is you can then also layer a filter that sits outside of both of these. Let me drag this over here, but can then control both groups. And I think this is where it's a little bit more of an advanced concept. I do agree with that, but I think it's really powerful, especially if you understand this. It can make your dashboards kind of just go up to the next level. So let's say, for example, we want both of these dashboards to be filtered by a certain material. So let's say, for example, you're a supplier and you're giving this model to a supplier and they only care about one SKU or maybe even one part, and they want to know what orders and where is that going to be being made. We can do that here by throwing on the material name and the dimension and just adding in the material name as a hidden dimension for all of these graphs. And I'll show you why we're doing that in a second. So we have this, so we all know the material here. And then what we're going to do is then we're going to say for each one of these groups, we have corresponding tab options. And we're going to say uncheck this box called ignore master filter. By default, it was checked. So we're going to click ignore that. And we're going to click ignore that. And now what you'll see is once I click on this fork, it filtered both of them simultaneously. Again, it's pretty neat. We can now filter independently or not. Additionally, we can then go dig deep into this one and it would just change this filter, this group. So this idea of groups I think is quite powerful, especially if you're trying to do comparisons and whatnot. And I really wanted to highlight that during our webinar because I think sometimes people are not aware of that. And I think that it's quite a powerful feature of our software. Okay, that's going to be it for the demo. Now I'm going to quickly jump back into the slides just to finish them up and then get to the questions. So we talked all about this during already. A few enhancements, I covered all those during the talk. And then the last thing is going to be tips. So as I mentioned before, through my experience with dashboards, the federated sources and logs and when to add one of them is really dependent on your use case. But sometimes, generally speaking, logs can be challenging to add data to. And that's really where the federated source, if it's simple, can be handy to use and kind of keep it in your back pocket as an option. However, sometimes if you do have very, very large data sources, federating can be a little bit, take some time for loading the model. I would say 99% of the time it's not a concern, but it's just something to note when you're building these large models, and especially with the data-driven approaches, that is a possibility. Lastly, next, I want to reiterate how powerful and flexible these importing and exporting of dashboards is. And I would definitely recommend everybody to utilize that because they can be stored on your computer and you can simply copy and paste a dashboard from a dashboard. Additionally, another one is the idea of using output tables for source data. For this example webinar, I didn't do it. I definitely could have, but I decided to focus on other things. But you can create your own data sources, not by federating, but actually creating or dashboarding off of a self-created or a user-created output table. And I think that's, if you have metrics that are kind of challenging and maybe you're storing them and using process logic, just use the output table is a really great approach for dashboarding. And lastly, it's this idea, and this is mostly just a best practice, duplicate a dashboard before you start editing it. And what I mean by that is, I'll go back in the software real quick. If we just saved this, is if we want to edit this dashboard, I would highly recommend that you duplicate it and then edit in the duplication. I would be remiss if I said I'm not perfect. I'll be the first one to admit that. And there's been a few times where I've made a mistake when I'm editing a dashboard and I wish I could go back. And it's just so much easier if you have a duplication and you're working on a duplication. And there really is no computational overhead to doing that. So I always recommend everybody to copy or duplicate their dashboards. With that, I want to turn it over. I think I'm on time for 9 minutes of questions. And I hope you all enjoyed that. And I'm happy to answer some questions now.
Yep, Good stuff, Jason. Thank you. So we got several questions that popped in here. I think you may have just addressed a few of these in your summary, but I'm going to go ahead and ask them anyway, and you might want to expound upon them. So first question, does dashboarding functionality support use of external data sources?
Yes, it does. Yep, so you might have saw briefly, but I'll show it again. When you actually add them, I didn't really harp on it, but in that window for adding a data source, you can pull in quite a few different types. You can see we support Excel, CSV. You can connect directly to a SQL source if you wanted to. All those things are directly connected to in the dashboard.
All right, perfect, perfect. Is it possible to export and consume created dashboards outside of the Simio desktop app?
Yes. So great point. I should have focused on this, but let me just exit this out. Yes. So you
That's
can
what
export.
questions are for.
Yep. So you can export these dashboards however you'd want. So if you can right click, so right now we're looking actually at the dashboard. We're not inside the editor, so we're actually in Simio right now. You can right click and export these to whoever you'd want, PDF, image, Excel, or you can export it itself. So I know customers of mine have exported these to Excel and they'll just do some analysis in Excel. You can also expand upon these. So if you don't want to, you can just make this whole thing bigger. There's quite a bit of UI tips and tricks inside the software as you click around.
All right, perfect. All right, can I use tables generated in Simio for Power BI or Tableau dashboards?
Yes, you can. Yep. So as I think it's kind of our motto here, Simio can be connected to almost anything. I have a lot of customers of mine that do use Tableau, but I will say that I've been slowly converting them because sometimes they say it's large data sources. The uploading to Tableau can take some time, and they've actually been enjoying using the dashboards inside of Simio because they're faster. So it's all application specific and use case specific, but I have heard that these are quicker, but it all depends on your data sources that you're using.
Okay, no, that's great. That's great to expound upon. If I import a dashboard to another model, will it be updated with the output data already present in that model?
If all the data sources match, yes, it will.
Okay, so an important point there. All right.
And all the columns. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Can you share some more applications of calculated field that you have used in the past?
Yep. So typically, a good example would be I was working with a customer of mine who had different types of operators, and depending on their name or some sort of delimitator in their name, maybe I think it was underscore afternoon and morning, so it's underscore A and underscore M, denoted which shift they were. So we wanted to know shift by shift what was the utilization. So we were more or less categorizing them like that. Additionally, I also have done quite a bit where depending on when the start and end time was, determining which shift that belonged to as well. So it's really kind of whatever you'd want. I think I would say probably about 75% of what you can do, you can just use it in no calculated fields, but it's those extra edge cases that you can really kind of further enhance. And if you're trying to extract a certain type of metric, they're quite capable. They have quite a lot of aggregate functions available in those calculated fields. So if you wanted to aggregate by certain parameters, you can do that as well. And this is probably a good time to mention that there is quite a bit of help on this online for dashboards as well. So I definitely recommend people to look in that. We point it to in our help menu. So like anything, we try to preach the philosophy we want to teach you to fish. So there's quite a bit of help text as well for dashboards. So feel free to use that as well as in the training if you are interested as well.
Good, good. All right, I think we have time for one more here. When dashboards are exported, what is the process of opening dashboard by a different user? Does he or she have to have the project open or have the actual Simio file?
Good question. Okay, so when you save a model, the XMLs will then live inside of that model, the SPX file. So if you're sharing a model with somebody else, the dashboards will come along with it. When you export a model or export a dashboard, it's going to be saved as a separate XML file, and then you then import that XML file into the model that you care about. But once the dashboard is inside the model, it's saved with that model. You can, of course, remove it We don't have to, if I created a model and I wanted to give it to Dan, he wouldn't have to then upload it and repaste that dashboard. Once I upload them in the model, they're going to save in that model, and he would be able to open those dashboards as well.
All right. Here's one. Someone typed in a last-minute question here. I'll read it off. That might be something you can answer quickly. We'll see. Dynamic optimization of simulated models. Is that possible?
I would need more information.
Okay. All right. So what I would recommend, since we are running out of time here, our email addresses, I will bring them back up here real quickly. Let me just shift back over to me very quickly. Bring our email addresses back up. Right there. Come on. Doesn't want to update for me today. This is. All right, there we go. So there's our email addresses, dvasalini@simio.com and jsarasoli@simio.com. So if you do have a question that didn't get answered during today's session, feel free to send it directly to one of us, and we'll get that question answered for you. If you are watching this session on recording, obviously you can email one of us as you see this information. Our next session is November the 18th. I'll bring that up very quickly here, just so everyone can see the name of that session again. Auto placement and creation of objects for rapid data-driven modeling. That, as I said, that'll be our Simio partner spotlight featuring SET on November the 18th. Obviously, you are more than welcome to watch these sessions recorded, but we always like to have as many live audience attendees as possible because it gives you the opportunity to ask questions live and get things a lot more addressed in the immediacy versus in the future. So with that being said, I think we are out of time. Jason, thank you for your presentation today. Thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate everyone's attendance, and we look forward to seeing everyone in a few weeks. Thanks again, and goodbye.